Just Energy with naturopath and medical intuitive Dr. Rita Louise. We have learned from Einstein's theories that matter and energy are one. Physicists believe that all systems in nature have their own particular way of vibrating. From the swing of a pendulum to the waves in the ocean to the light that brightens the sky each day, each of these oscillates at its own unique rate. In the same way, things such as rocks and minerals vibrate very slowly and at speeds that are imperceptible to us. Living things such as plants, animals, and man vibrate faster and appear to be alive. The same holds true for every thought, feeling, event, or word we speak. Each has its own frequency or rate of vibration. What many of us don't realize is if we take everything in our own universe down to its simplest form, it is all just energy. Join Dr. Rita as she explores questions such as, what are we made of? Why do we get sick? How can I live a more balanced and whole life? Call in and talk to her and her thought-provoking guest. Send us your questions and get the help you need to move beyond any obstacles or challenges that may be affecting your life, right from the source. So stay tuned and explore your possibilities.
Hello and welcome to Just Energy Radio. I'm your host, Dr. Rita Louise, and thank you all for tuning into the show today. Today we have a 2-hour show where we're going to be speaking with Dr. Robert Schoch about a bunch of the different ancient monuments that are around the world, including Egypt and Bosnia and Syria and all kinds of stuff. I am looking forward to it because, as I guess you guys are figuring out, I like talking about this stuff, and we always have really cool conversations. But just a little housekeeping. Just Energy Radio is brought to you by SoulHealer.com and the Institute of Applied Energetics. That's AppliedEnergeticsInstitute.com, where you can study to become an energy medicine practitioner, intuitive counselor, or certified medical intuitive. To keep up with the show, please do go to www.justenergyradio.com and sign up for our newsletter. You can also go and check out our over 4 years' worth of archives that are free, and you can download them. Just Energy Radio is also aired live on Fate Radio. You can pick up episodes on iTunes as well as YouTube. So let me tell you a little bit about Dr. Schoch, and we're going to get him on air and get going. Dr. Robert Schoch, a full-time faculty member at the College of General Studies at Boston University since 1984. He earned his Ph.D. in Geology and Geophysics at Yale University. He holds an MS and a Master's in Philosophy in, I'm assuming that's Master's of Philosophy in Geology and Geophysics from Yale, as well as degrees in Anthropology and Geology from George Washington University. Dr. Schoch has been quoted extensively in the media for his pioneering research recasting the dates of the Great Sphinx of Egypt, which we're going to talk about, as well as his work on ancient cultures and monuments in such diverse countries as Peru, Bosnia, and Japan. So please welcome to Just Energy Radio, Dr. Robert Schoch. Hi, Robert. How are you?
Hello. Very good. Thank you.
I'm hoping that static just goes away.
Really? I don't hear it.
Oh, I did. So how are you? Thank you so much for coming on the show.
Oh, it's my pleasure. I'm very well. Thank you. Glad to be here.
I'm just excited to have you. I first became aware of you when you were doing your work with John Anthony West on the Sphinx and the Sphinx dating,
right,
which we're going to come back to. But
okay,
how did you first get involved in looking at culture and the dating of culture from a geological perspective?
Oh, first, probably goes back to my undergraduate days, because as you mentioned, I have a degree in anthropology. I also have a degree in geology at undergraduate level. And I actually began, of all things, I was going to be an art history major in my freshman year. That's what I wanted to study. And I wasn't interested in just any old art, but actually ancient art. Ancient art always fascinated me. I can't remember a time that I was not fascinated by ancient art and architecture. So I initially wanted to go into that. I decided I didn't like my art history teacher. I was taking a geology course, found that absolutely fascinating, took an anthropology course, found that absolutely fascinating. But at that time where I was at George Washington University, archaeology was part of anthropology. So I sort of did anthropology/archaeology on the one hand, geology on the other hand, then went on to get advanced degrees in geology and geophysics, and sort of came back around to applying that to what my first love was, which was really ancient art, ancient history, ancient architecture. So it sort of goes around.
It does. When I was a kid, I wanted to be an archaeologist until I found out you had to have a Ph.D. And so I was like, well, I don't want to go to school that long, and I have one anyway. So
exactly. I was going to say, look what happened anyway, right?
Let's talk about your work on the Sphinx. I'm just going to give it to you to just kind of introduce it to the listeners. I think that might be the best way of handling that.
Okay. Well, I first got involved in the Sphinx in the really late 1980s, so we're talking over 20 years ago now. The conventional date, to summarize very briefly, conventional date on the Sphinx, when I say conventional, the standard archaeological Egyptological attribution is 2500 BC, 4,500 years ago. I was, as you already mentioned, introduced to the Sphinx in the sense of that there's a controversy around the Sphinx, or there should be a controversy around the Sphinx, over the date by John Anthony West, because he pointed out that a person before him, Schwaar de Lubitsch in particular, had noted that there's a discrepancy between the weathering on the body of the Sphinx and the weathering that you see on all the other structures around the Sphinx, all the other ancient structures, the pyramids, the tombs, that type of thing on the Giza Plateau. And the discrepancy, is really a geological feature, that you have different types of weathering. So he first introduced me to this problem, this conundrum, and I went over there. 1990 was my first trip to Egypt, studied it as a geologist. I had had long had my Ph.D. in geology at that point, and it was pretty straightforward to me as a geologist that you had one type of weathering on the oldest portion of the Sphinx, what I call the core body of the Sphinx, and that weathering is caused by rain. It's caused by heavy rain, protracted rains, precipitation, basically water. But this is incompatible with the fact that the Sphinx now sits on the edge of the Sahara Desert, and we know it's been Sahara Desert for the last 5,000 years. So it seemed pretty clear to me immediately as a geologist that there's something wrong here, that the only way you get that very distinctive, we'll call it water weathering, is if the body of the Sphinx goes back earlier in time, goes back to a different climatic regime, a time when there was more moisture, more rain, just a whole different era than the last 5,000 years. The problem is, for Egyptologists and conventional historians, that means that the Sphinx, this incredible statue, is much, much older than they thought. It actually predates the origins of what they consider civilization. So this caused a huge ruckus when I first announced it, and it hasn't totally died down since. And in the last 20 years, I've been... What?
I love it personally.
I love it personally. I come to love it. I was actually quite disturbed by it initially, in a sense like that. Who were a bunch of archaeologists to question a geologist that was well trained at Yale? I don't mean that in a snotty way, but I can give a lot of anecdotes. I'll give one quick one. I first announced the results of the work in 1991. And since then I've built up a lot more evidence to support it and confirm it, and I've been doing that ever since. And, I try to be a good scientist, and if the evidence does not support me, so be it. But in fact, it all supports me at this point. But in 1991, I gave the first presentation. It was at the Geological Society of America. To make a long story short, when I gave the presentation, all the geologists in the audience, they thought it made sense. They agreed with me, et cetera, et cetera. The Egyptologists immediately, and when I say immediately, they weren't there, but newspapers like the New York Times would immediately call an Egyptologist that wasn't even there, had not even seen the evidence, ask them what they thought, and immediately the Egyptologists would say, no, that's absolutely impossible. We know how old it is. It's basically close your mind. We know the answer. We're not going to look at new evidence. We know that he's wrong even if we haven't looked at his evidence. So that was pretty annoying from a scientist's point of view. The other anecdote I was going to give is right before I gave the presentation, I was sitting down with a good friend of mine, Ph.D. in geology, very good stratigrapher. We were close, and, he was very honest with me. So I'm showing him the stuff. I'm showing him the preview of what I'm going to speak about, and he starts laughing hysterically. And I was a little uptight, maybe. I couldn't understand why he was laughing at me, and I thought I'd made some really stupid mistake, and here I was about to go on and present it, and I said, well, what's wrong? Where did I mess up? I thought, I better just withdraw my paper and not speak about it. He said, no. He said, it's so simple. It's so straightforward. Why didn't these guys see this 200 years ago? And then I felt good, because so it's been an interesting journey in the sense of my fellow geologists really accepting it, and they don't have a vested interest. That's the thing. They don't have a vested interest in when civilization began, how far back civilization goes, how far back the Sphinx goes. But the Egyptologists, I'll call them conventional historians, they don't like it at all, and they're still fighting it to a certain extent.
And the timeline that they're using goes back to like the Greeks, give or take.
Yeah.
Where they say that the flood happened 3,000 years BC, and And it's like, we're using a 2,000-year-old timeline.
Yeah, they're using a totally different timeline. And essentially as I've developed this, and we could get into some of the other evidence that confirms it in some of the other cultures, but, essentially the way I would phrase it in a nutshell right now is that there was very advanced civilizations, very advanced cultures on Earth at least 10 to 12,000 years ago. There's no doubt about that at this point in my mind. Essentially, at the end or just before the end of the last ice age, and these seem to have been wiped out, I believe, catastrophically. And I would not have even thought this way 25 years ago, but the evidence is clear. It's there that we essentially. One way we could think of it is we had a round of advanced civilizations up till maybe 10,000 years ago that got wiped out, really set back into what we could see as a dark age for thousands of years, and then what the conventional archaeologists are referring to, what they study, really is the re-rise, the civilizations that rose out of those ashes, if we could metaphorically, about 5,000 years ago. But they don't want to acknowledge anything before about 5,000 years, give or take. They don't want to acknowledge anything that's really sophisticated, that's really at a level we would call civilization.
One of the things, how do I want to phrase this? Even on TV, I'm going to kind of question something that I heard you say on TV, was that the erosion had to have happened, sometime prior to 7,000 years ago.
Yeah.
But in my mind, I'm thinking, there was water, the water kind of dried up 7,000 years ago. how long do you think the water needed to flow in that area in order to create that level of erosion?
Yeah, that's a really good point. And I started out being incredibly conservative. When I say started out, I'm talking 20 years ago, being very conservative that, it has to be at least so old, but it could be older. And a very good point, and it's very well taken, which you just pointed out, is that you need to have not just that it didn't erode in 3 days at the very end of the wet period. It would have taken a fair amount of time because you have a meter or so worth of erosion, if not more, depth of erosion on the Sphinx and in what's known as the Sphinx enclosure. The Sphinx is actually carved down into the bedrock, so those that have not been to Egypt don't always realize it, but the body of the Sphinx sits below ground level. You have to look down into what's known as the Sphinx enclosure or Sphinx ditch. So as a geologist, what's happening on the walls of that enclosure are actually as important to me as what's happening to the body of the Sphinx itself, because the erosional features are even better preserved on the walls of the enclosure. But it's very deep erosion. I suspect, in answer to your question, it took a couple of thousand years realistically to develop that level of erosion. The second thing, which all my critics ignore consistently because they just don't understand it, is that Thomas DeBecke, a very good Texas geophysicist, and I did seismic studies around the Sphinx. We were looking for subsurface erosional features. Let me back up. It's technically not erosion, subsurface weathering features. Subsurface weathering features, basically mineralogical changes that occur after the surface has been exposed, the depth of that weathering. You can use that to calibrate how long the surface has been exposed. To put it simply, when you look at that, you're pushing back to, by the most realistic estimates, at least 8,000 or more BC. So you're really pushing it back again, and that is absolutely confirmatory of what I interpret from the surface. So, I mean, all the data fits together exquisitely. To say that this cannot be dynastic, it cannot be 2,500 BC. It has to be at least 10,000 or more years old.
And I would think that it would take longer than even a couple of thousand years to get that kind of weathering to happen.
I'm still being a bit conservative. I admit that. It's a real question. What is the terminus on the other end? So, for instance, John Anthony West, and he's not the only one, but I'll point him out, he has suggested that it could be even a couple of tens of thousands of years. There have been some very competent geologists, not in this country, the U.S., but actually, I think from the Ukraine, and I've read their papers, that have suggested that we're talking on the order of tens of thousands of years for the core body. Now, honestly, I just don't go there at this point. But it's an open question as to how far it goes back, and my thinking more and more has been, at least 10,000, 12,000 years. And I think this now correlates, a dating like that seems to correlate with other sites. For instance, a site in Turkey, Gobekli Tepe, that I visited last May, that is well dated by independent means, in this case, in part at least by radiocarbon, to going back to the period 8,000 to 10,000 years at a minimum. So
we're definitely going to talk about that
BC.
one.
What?
We're definitely going to talk about that.
Yeah. So I mean,
later on the show.
You've got a situation where now you've got other sites that are confirming that there is major stuff going on in the sense of major civilization, major sophistication, at least 10,000 to 12,000 years ago. It's easy to get mixed up with years ago versus BP or BC. So we have to be clear on that. But, essentially thinking as a geologist at the end of the last ice age, which is approximately, well, technically it's 9,700 BC by the best dating. This is the end of the last ice age. And it seems that we have sophisticated civilization, sophisticated culture before the end of the last ice age, which is really quite amazing.
So there was a question in the chat room, and I had not the same question but something similar, is the whole concept that the actual head of the Sphinx was, I like the lion head kind of going along with the alignment with Leo, but then there's people that talk about it being a jackal.
Okay, let me clarify. A lot of thoughts. Let me clarify a couple of things. First off, it's the head that is on the body right now is an Egyptian dynastic head. That's very clear. That head is not the original head. That head has been recarved. It's like we found Michelangelo and his face. Michelangelo, what am I saying? Michelangelo's David, one of his statues. And the face was messed up, so you recarve the face, you recarve the head because there's still enough there to make a head out of it, but now the head is too small for the body. Anyone that has looked at the Sphinx with a candid eye and critical eye, I think will immediately see that the head of the Sphinx is way too small for the body. And it's simply because, in my opinion, and I've climbed on the back of the Sphinx and looked at it firsthand, that head is not the original head. I believe my instinct, and we don't have evidence for this, direct evidence, we only have indirect evidence. My instinct is that the head originally was a lion, that we're talking a recumbent lion, a lion, with a full male lion with a full head, mane, that type of thing. And, that head was eroded just as the body is eroded. Now, the head is a slightly different lithology. It's slightly harder. It has, it's more dolomitic, to use a technical term, but still would have been heavily eroded. And the dynastic Egyptians clearly repaired the body by putting little blocks of limestone. Some of them are pretty big blocks, but filling in gaps with blocks of limestone. What they did with the head is they simply recarved it down to repair it in that sense. And when they recarved it, I believe they recarved it, into a human head, not whatever the original head was, which I suspect was a lion. Jackal, that jackal concept, the dog concept, the Nubis concept, and the concept that there was a moat around the Sphinx was popularized recently by Robert Temple. And not to be nasty, but from a geologic point of view, it's nonsense. It doesn't work. The weathering that you see around the Sphinx, in the Sphinx enclosure, is not what you expect if it were a moat. If the water was coming up from above, he misinterpreted a number of features. I don't believe for a second that the Sphinx was ever a jackal. I just don't see any evidence for that whatsoever. The proportions of the head actually don't work. He's talked about, for instance, a flat back, that type of thing. That's not the original back. The reason it's flat now is because it's weathered down to a sedimentary layer that's relatively hard, and it's a flat, stratigraphy. So there's a lot going on there. I do think, though, I am quite open to the concept that the Sphinx originally was facing its own astronomical sign rising on the eastern horizon. And in fact, the Sphinx originally, and this is something I determined geologically, it originally emerged from the bedrock. So the rear of the Sphinx originally merged into the bedrock. It was only cut out later, and the body was freed up in the back on the western end in dynastic times, and you can tell that from looking at the surface weathering as well as the subsurface weathering. So it originally emerged from the plateau, just like during the age of Leo, the Sphinx would have, at the proper time of year, faced its own astronomical form in the sky, the constellation Leo, and Leo actually would have been emerging from the horizon, if you would, with its rump on the horizon. So, again, I'm not absolutely saying that was the case. That is a secondary feature in my mind. I'm a geologist. I wouldn't date it based on that, but it's interesting that it does seem to correlate with the date I'm finding independently based on the geology. If that makes sense.
No, it totally makes sense to me.
Yeah.
The part that I find. Go ahead.
Yeah. No. I was going to say there's no evidence, in my opinion, for a jackal or for a dog that the Sphinx was ever that. I think it was definitely a lion or some kind of lion-type form.
The part that I find humorous, and I'd like for you to speak to this, is, well, maybe.
Yeah.
The point, all right, you look at the Sphinx itself, and there's this major weathering going on to the point that it's been repaired in ancient times multiple times.
Yeah.
And then you look at the head, and I mean, okay, part of the headdress was missing in more modern times, but the level of erosion is not even remotely close. How do they connect those dots? How do they connect those dots?
Oh, the Egyptologists?
Yeah.
Yeah, well, like I said, I mean, it's clearly been recarved, and that's why you have that discrepancy. The Egyptologists really don't explain it. I've never heard a good, cogent explanation from the Egyptologists, if that's what you mean.
Yeah, well, that was kind of my question.
Yeah. No, seriously, it's a real problem. In fact, I even pointed out to certain Egyptologists that the Sphinx is disproportionate. I mean, when I first saw the Sphinx, the very first time I saw the Sphinx over 20 years ago, I said, to myself, well, actually I think I said it to the people with me too, the head is too small for the body. It doesn't look right. It's out of proportion. And, I said this to certain Egyptologists who don't like me otherwise anyway, perhaps, and they said, no, can't be, that's nonsensical because the Sphinx is the greatest sculpture in the world, blah, blah, blah. To the credit of one, of course, he never acknowledged me, he actually did a study of a bunch of sphinxes, because there are lots of smaller sphinxes. Many of them are 16 feet long or whatever, but smaller sphinxes, head-to-body ratios, that type of thing. Sure enough, the Great Sphinx, the head is way too small for the body compared to all the others. Which is exactly what I think anyone can see. Also, I want to point out that while we're talking about the head, the classical view is that the head of the Sphinx is the face of Khafra, or Chephren, he's sometimes called, a ruler of a ruler of the 4th dynasty who is associated with the second pyramid on the Giza Plateau, about 2500 BC. This is a major reason that Egyptologists attribute the Sphinx to 2500 BC, because they say that the head of the Sphinx represents the face of the pharaoh Khafra, or Chephren. And, we've looked at that very carefully. We've had a forensic police officer come out, reconstruct, analyze the face of the Sphinx compared to a number of statues of Khafra, also known as Chephren, and they're not the same face. They're not even the same race. It didn't take a police officer to tell me that. The first time I saw the Sphinx, I said, this is, and I don't want to use a politically incorrect term, but it's an African face, it's a black face, it's a Nubian face, whatever you want to call it. It's not a white Caucasian face, if we could call it that, which is the face of Khafra. He was, much more Mediterranean, should we say. It's not even the same race. The Egyptologists, not to be nasty, but are out of it sometimes.
Robert, there's the music, which means we need to take a quick break, but let's come back, talk about
it goes by quickly.
More. Yes.
Sure.
And I want to get into the Hall of Records.
Sure.
I'm Dr. Rita Louise. We're talking to Robert Schoch about, right now we're talking about ancient Egypt and the Sphinx, and we'll be back after these words from our sponsors.
Just Energy Radio with your host, Dr. Rita Louise, will return right after these messages. And now back to Just Energy Radio with Dr. Rita Louise.
Hello and welcome back to Just Energy Radio. I'm Dr. Rita Louise, and we're here speaking with Dr. Robert Schoch. His webpage is robertschoch.com. Robert, before the break, we were talking about the space on the Sphinx and that it wasn't Cheops, supposedly.
Exactly.
Has anyone looked through statuary and come up with any correlation that looks anything closer?
Well, yes and no, and mostly no. Okay, so actually, not to correct you too much, but it's generally referred to Khufu, Khafra Chevron. Some people have referred it to Khufu or Cheops. They're depending on who you talk to, either brothers or father, son. But basically, that family group. Some have put it on another brother or a half-brother of the same family group. And so in recent years, and I believe that in large part this is due to what I and my colleagues, John Anthony West in particular, have been saying, that it's not clearly Khafra, and some of the Egyptologists have now been trying to pin it to other family members of the same dynasty. In some cases, in some cases, it's basically the argument, well, it's okay, we accept it's not so-and-so, and we accept it's not so-and-so, but then it must be so-and-so. Well, where's the proof that it's that person of the dynasty? Well, we have no images of them, so we don't know what they look like, so we might as well say it's them. Does that make sense? It doesn't quite make sense.
Well, I mean,
to
it
me.
makes sense in a nonsensical kind of way.
Exactly. So it's like they can't be proven wrong if they now hypothesize it's so-and-so, but we don't really know who that person looks, what that person looks like. So that it gets sort of silly. The bottom line for me, and I'll after having studied it, is that I'm not convinced it's any known pharaoh. There have been some suggestions that it was recarved very late, maybe a middle or even New Kingdom pharaoh. I don't find that particularly compelling either, for various reasons, including the headdress and that type of thing are not correct. It is known that it was revived, the Sphinx was revived in New Kingdom times. It was dug out of the sand. It was, if not totally reworked, which I don't believe it was sort of repaired, freshened up, that type of thing. So just like, and I often use this analogy, just like a cathedral in Europe today that may go back 1,000 years, it will have modern wiring perhaps, it's been repaired. A lot of these have been used for centuries, literally. So you have to be very careful looking at repairs or reworking. Getting back to the current face, though, my personal best estimate is that it is an early dynastic recarving, early dynastic, maybe even first or second dynasty, that, as I mentioned before the break, in my opinion, and I'm not the only one with this, professionals who study faces, forensic experts have confirmed this. It's essentially an African or black face. And in early dynastic, the early dynastic period, first and second dynasty, there's a lot of evidence that we'll call it the African or black influence was much stronger in Egypt, particularly the ruling class of Egypt. So I think it's all compatible with a first, second dynasty face in recarving. Now, who that specifically is, I don't know. In fact, I would suggest that it may not be a real specific person. It may be a more, should we say, generic face. This also gets into whether it's a male or female. Do you have any opinion on that?
No.
To me, the Sphinx has always been female. it's a female face. A lot of people disagree with that. It might be more, gender neutral. But I remember once flying back from Egypt, and there was, we'll just call her an African woman, a couple of aisles in front of me. I mean, clearly a woman. And I looked at her face, and her face was so close to the face of the Sphinx. It was unbelievable. I wished I would have embarrassed myself to ask her to take a picture. Why do you want a picture of me? Oh, you look like the Sphinx. Then on the other hand, some people have accused me of looking like the Sphinx, so who knows? And I'm neither female nor African American.
I'm gonna
and one other thing for your listeners: the Sphinx once had a beard. But that does not mean it originally had a beard. It may have been a New Kingdom edition. And there's pieces of the beard now, I think, in the British Museum. Parts of it are in the Cairo Museum, the Egyptian Museum in Cairo. So, again, it's been worked and reworked. And also, of course, in ancient Egypt, at certain levels, female pharaohs like Hatshepsut might wear a false beard. So that doesn't mean anything either.
So I'm going to switch gears here real quick because there was a question in the chat room which kind of goes with the question I had, but then we're going to come back to the Sphinx part. Okay. And so the question is from Rich, and he said, would you ask Dr. Schoch his thinking on the geology of the stones used to construct the pyramids, recalling Christopher Dunn's thinking that the pyramids were machines? Any thoughts on that?
That's a hard one. I know Chris, and I think he has a lot of good evidence. I reviewed I think I even wrote a blurb for his latest book. And yeah, he has a lot of evidence that there was some kind of, we'll call it machining being done on some of the stones, some of the blocks, that type of thing. And yeah, it's very clear that they were sawing even granite. They were drilling, they were cutting. I mean, Sir Flinders Petrie pointed this out. Sir Flinders Petrie pointed this out in the 19th century, that they were doing some kind of drilling, sawing, cutting, and how they were doing this, it's really unclear. Chris has posited, huge circular saws and maybe using some of what are referred to as boat pits. Chris has suggested, of course, in a previous publications, earlier books, that Giza itself was a power plant, that type of thing. I don't know if he still holds that view. He's done a very detailed study of a lot of the statues going into New Kingdom and whatnot, showing that there was some kind of, we'll call it machining done. Now, whether that was machining in a modern sense, with very high speed or slower speed, but very precise, it's very hard to know. It does suggest in some cases, though, he has very strong evidence that they were cutting, and they were cutting so, if not rapidly, so persistently that they had a hard time stopping in some cases, so they would overcut a little bit, which, if you think of someone using a power tool and you're buzzing through something, like a piece of wood, and you go a little bit further than you mean to, you see that in ancient Egyptian stonework, which is pretty amazing. So something's going on there. On the other hand, that's not all the stonework in Egypt. If you get back to the pyramids, you asked specifically about the pyramids. You see this type of what I'll call machining in things like the sarcophagus. It's probably not a sarcophagus, but we'll just call it that, or the coffer in the so-called King's Chamber, which is not the King's Chamber, but that's what people call it, the granite coffer in the so-called King's Chamber in the Great Pyramid. I mean, it's clearly has evidence of the machining type of features that Chris is talking about. On the other hand, when you look at the vast majority of limestone that goes into things like the Great Pyramid, most of that, I think all the evidence, in my opinion, from a geologist, is that they were quarrying it out using fairly, I don't want to say crude, but it's not like they were using big power saws to cut out the blocks necessarily. In some cases, they seem to have been sawing it. In other cases, they seem to have been just breaking them out. But even that is not that unusual if they did have machining capabilities, because to this day when you quarry rock, you don't necessarily cut it. A lot of times you just fracture it out also, even in modern times. So it's not, I may not have given a simple answer, but there is no simple answer to it.
Okay.
I don't know if
I
answered the question.
You did. And for the people that are listening, we did have Christopher Dunn, talking about some of the statuary in Egypt. It was a fascinating interview, and it's in the Just Energy Radio archive.
Yeah, the statuary work that he's talked about and how they've were clearly using some kind of tools around that. I mean, they were doing incredible things. I to summarize it, and he has pointed up some of the technological aspects. I mean, they had clearly, and I think we don't understand it fully to this point, but they had incredible technological sophistication when it came to certain things, and I think they had incredible, we'll call it philosophical, spiritual sophistication when it came to many things too. So, again, one lesson from the ancient Egyptians and many ancient cultures is that it wasn't just dumb old them and smart old us. They knew things on many levels that have, lost, that we don't have at this point. And so it's very hard to know.
I've joked around on this show. It's like, they came out of their caves with their little sticks and rocks and made these great things.
Right. Now, actually, let me address another aspect of that while we're at it.
Okay.
We talked about the Sphinx, and there were a couple of things I forgot about the Sphinx. We should mention the chamber underneath too at some point. You mentioned that.
Oh no, we're definitely going to do that.
Yeah, we'll get to that. But let me mention something else about the Sphinx. I mentioned, and a lot of people don't realize this. The Sphinx is carved. The body is carved out of the bedrock. The head started out as probably geologically a big, not a boulder technically, but a big outcropping above the plateau, which would have been carved into a face, and then they carved the body. But they had to carve down into the bedrock to carve the body. Now, there's a couple of ways you could carve the bedrock like that. One would be to just basically smash it and break it up into a bunch of chips and, cut it away into small pieces, cart it away as essentially rubble in baskets, something like that. That would be relatively easy and unsophisticated technologically. That is not what they did. They actually quarried around the Sphinx. They took out blocks, in some cases, weighing tens of tons, maybe 50 tons or more in some cases. They quarried out huge blocks. As they were carving the body of the Sphinx, they moved these blocks to the east of the current position of the Sphinx, and they made a temple, what we now call the Sphinx Temple, which sits due east of the Sphinx. Now, what's important about this is that temple it's very ruinous at this point, but even in its ruins, it's an absolutely incredible temple made out of massive limestone blocks, bigger on average than the blocks in the pyramids to the west of the Sphinx. And the pyramids are much more famous, but in fact these temples in many ways are much more magnificent if you think about how they were built, the tolerances, the size of the blocks that were moved, how they were moved and positioned in a relatively small confines. And the thing is, they were doing that to carve out the body of the Sphinx. By my geology, my analysis, the body of the Sphinx was carved out, let's say, about 10,000 years ago. So that means that temple goes back that far. In many ways, I think building that temple is even more astounding at such an early date than the Sphinx itself, if you follow the line of reasoning there. So, I mean, they're really doing incredible things at a very early date.
All right, now this is going to sound like kind of a duh question, but I'm just going to put it out there because I think a lot of people have confusion in this area, because people have put out the belief that the Sphinx and the pyramids were made around the same time. Based on your observation of the weathering, I mean, there's still some of that limestone left on the pyramids.
Yeah.
Do they date
No, they're not the same age.
Time?
I'm sorry?
No, go ahead. You're answering.
No, they're not. I think what you're asking is, are they the same age, the Sphinx and the pyramids?
Mm-hmm.
And I would say absolutely not. But then I have to give you all the ifs, ands, and buts. The pyramids that you see on the Giza Plateau right now, there's a Great Pyramid, the second pyramid, the third pyramid. The third pyramid's much smaller. I do not believe that those date back to the same age as the original Sphinx. I think that those pyramids, as we see them today, are later structures, but they're probably built upon earlier structures, earlier sites. So if you think of the Sphinx as having been there much earlier than dynastic Egypt, and then the Sphinx itself was taken over, repaired, reworked, the head was recarved. Okay, now think about where the pyramids are. The pyramids, I believe, basically sit on the sites of either older structures or simply what we could call sacred sites. So if you look at the Great Pyramid, I'll give you two examples. The Great Pyramid sits actually on top of a natural mound or a natural hill in the bedrock, and this has been known since the late 19th century. And I believe that natural mound or natural hill was essentially sacred for whatever reason, and that is why the Great Pyramid was built there. Under the Great Pyramid is what's known as a subterranean chamber, and I believe that that dates back at least a couple of thousand years prior to dynastic times. So I think that chamber under the Great Pyramid is older. The pyramid itself, the Great Pyramid itself, I think that when I look at the evidence, without going into great detail here, that it was built essentially in stages up to about the 50th level. If you think of the levels of stone that go into the Great Pyramid, probably up to the 50th level or so was an earlier stage of it, probably intermediate in age between the Sphinx, the oldest portions of the Sphinx, and the conventional date for the Great Pyramid. And then it was built up further later. It was refurbished. It was probably coated with the most recent layer of limestone in the Fourth Dynasty at its latest age. So these structures are, it's more complicated than the Great Pyramid was just built at such and such a date. They were built, they were rebuilt, they were built on top of earlier structures. If we look at the second pyramid on the Giza Plateau, the so-called Khafra Pyramid, I think there's actually evidence that that might be older than the Great Pyramid, at least the core structure underneath. The second pyramid has a ring of granite around its base, which was used in dynastic times in many cases to indicate that they were restoring or refurbishing an older structure, that they were basically covering over or refurbishing an older structure. So again, they may be refurbishing it. If you look at the third pyramid, the so-called Menkaure Pyramid, it is covered with granite, actually more than just a ring around the base, up the sides of it, which may be indication of refurbishing. Give you one more example on Dashur, which is outside of Giza, but also still relatively close to Cairo, in northern Egypt. You have what's known as the Red Pyramid, again a Old Kingdom pyramid. So going back about 2600 BC or so, you go inside that, and all the classical Egyptologists agree it's about 2600 BC, and I would not question that. But when you go inside, there's a particular chamber inside where it's very clear to me as a geologist that there is an older structure in the middle of that pyramid, and the pyramid was essentially built around and over that much older structure.
And from what I remember, that happened a lot like in South America, where they would start with an original structure and then build a bigger pyramid and a bigger pyramid on top of it. Absolutely. Very, very good analogy. And this happens, it even happens,
Christian times, in Europe, you start with a little church in the 5th century A.D. or whatever, and then you build a bigger one in the 8th century. You build a big cathedral over that in the 12th century or whatever. I mean, it's actually, to me, it's pretty much what you expect. But the point being here, when you asked about the pyramids, you have to distinguish between what you're looking at now, which are, 2600 BC, and I don't doubt that. But unlike classical Egyptologists who just say, okay, they were built in 2600 BC from scratch, nothing was there, I think in virtually every case, well, at least in a number of cases where I've specific cases that I've explored, they're actually built on top of, over, protecting, however you want to say it, much older structures or much older sites. Depends on the particular pyramid.
Okay, so you mentioned a subterranean chamber. Are you talking about the Queen's Chamber, or are you talking about something entirely different that they don't really talk about?
No, not the Queen's Chamber. In the Great Pyramid, there are major chambers. The King's Chamber is sort of the highest one up, and above that are so-called relieving chambers, and that's where the cartouches are that some people make a stink about. I've been up there a couple of times. There's a grand gallery, so I'm working from the top down. Grand gallery, then there's a Queen's Chamber, then there's a descending passage that goes down under the pyramid, into the bedrock, hundreds of meters down. You have to go down the descending passage, and you're now down into the bedrock below the pyramid, well under the pyramid. That's what I'm referring to, subterranean chamber, or sometimes it's known as the pit. Many people haven't been there. If you just go as a casual tourist, you generally don't get to go down there. They don't generally have it open. But it's actually, if you want to talk about, some people get into, and we haven't gone there yet, but, sort of the power and sacredness, or the, I don't know, however people want to express it, where is it more energetic or less energetic within the Great Pyramid? And my personal experience has been that it's a subterranean chamber. It's deep under the pyramid, which, again, reinforce, I believe that's much older than the superstructure above it, that subterranean chamber was there before any of the pyramid that was built over it.
Well, based on mythological evidence, which I'm not going to go into, the subterranean aspect of the mountains and these mountainous structures makes a lot more sense than it being a tomb.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, there's no. I didn't even mention that. In my opinion, there's no evidence it was actually a tomb, any more than cathedrals are built as tombs per se. Was it maybe used secondarily for that purpose? I'll maybe give that to the Egyptologists, but it wasn't primarily a tomb, in my opinion.
Well, the question that I've asked a number of people when talking about this topic was, if they had to blow a hole in the wall of the pyramid to gain access to it in the 1800s, whenever they finally got inside?
No, actually very much earlier, 7th century or so. I mean, over 1,000 years ago.
7th century.
Yeah.
And when did all the tomb raiders get in there to steal all the stuff, and how did they get in there if we couldn't get in there by blowing a hole inside?
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, people that say it was full of stuff and that was a burial and everything was stolen, and the classical explanations aren't real cogent. They leave a lot to be desired if you think about them logically, in my opinion.
But it does make something fun to laugh at while you're watching TV going, did they just say that? That doesn't make any sense. Exactly. You know what I want to do, Robert? I think we're going to take a break here and come back and talk about the Hall of Record, or the subterranean chamber that's supposed to be under...
the one that's under the Sphinx.
Yeah.
Not the one under the Great Pyramid.
Yeah, the one under the Sphinx, the elusive one.
That sounds good.
Okay, cool. I'm Dr. Rita Louise. We're talking to Dr. Robert Schoch. His website is robertschoch.com, and we'll be back after these words from our sponsors.
Just Energy Radio with your host, Dr. Rita Louise, will return right after these messages.